All right, we're here. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thanks so much for joining us on a Friday. Chris Brown is here with me. Josh Doring not here today, but Chris is here. We're holding down the fort. Got some things to talk about today. Chris, how you doing?
Doing pretty good, Josh. We have some good stuff to talk about because things are getting interesting here. I'm eager to discuss later on here what this is going to look like for the fourth number one seed in the NCAA tournament, because all of a sudden, maybe that's not so guaranteed. So we have a good bit to talk about in college basketball and a good weekend coming up too to discuss.
Yeah, I and losing in Ohio State, losing to Michigan State. I don't want to jump to too many
Right.
conclusions and hasty generalizations, but earlier this week I talked about how Gonzaga and Baylor in my Final Four, no doubt, and they're in my national championship game.
Mm-hmm.
But feel pretty good about Michigan. Feel even better about Michigan and what they did last night to Iowa, and we'll get to that in a moment here as well. And I was confident in putting Ohio State fourth on that list, and maybe that was a bit of an overreaction, but I don't really feel like it was. But
Mm-hmm.
when we're talking about trying to nitpicks and or pick nits, I suppose, and differentiate these teams, what happened to Ohio State last night hasn't even really almost happened, apart from Michigan at Minnesota, but I think that was very fluky. Um, that kind of thing hasn't happened to Gonzaga, Baylor, Michigan, and every time Michigan takes the floor, we're talking about them getting even closer to that level that Gonzaga and Baylor on, or at the very least the level that Baylor's on. Because man, they impress me every time they take the floor.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, we were already having that kind of discussion on Monday about, how do we want to, it's sort of a clear top four, but is it really sort of like a 1A, 1B, and 1C with Gonzaga, Baylor, and Michigan? And I feel even more confident that it's sort of like a very clear top three, the combination of what we saw Michigan do last night with what happened to Ohio State sort of makes it more clear to me that really I think we should be talking about a clear top three teams.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, whether you want to continue to look at, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, a little bit more here in a minute, but whether you want to continue to look at Michigan and, right, like there's always going to be, when we're talking about the thin margins that separate, team number one versus team number three, right? Michigan hasn't had, just by nature of their schedule and the games that they've had postponed, they haven't gotten a chance to play, these, a ton of these. The record, the resume just isn't as extensive yet.
Mm-hmm.
But like we're at the point here where it's like there's not much, there's nothing else they can do. Like this is right. This is everything you could possibly want from them against the best teams that they have on their schedule.
It really is because it was a fair concern, right? I mean, up until
Sure.
Michigan beat
Oh yeah.
Ohio State, their best win was probably against a Wisconsin team that is
Yeah.
not anywhere near not anywhere near inspiring, right? And
Yeah.
now they've done something in back-to-back games that completely eradicate any skepticism that somebody can have about Michigan. There's just nothing left that they can do unless you just feel like Michigan isn't that good, right? Um,
Mm.
they beat Ohio State. That's the best. I would argue. You can argue that Minnesota beating Michigan is the best win of the season so far, but I really think that Michigan going into Ohio State and beating the Buckeyes is the best win that any team has this season. And then they go and just
Yeah.
flex their muscles against Iowa, especially in the second half. Uh, Michigan was up by 3 at halftime against Iowa, ends up winning 79-57. It really quickly didn't get all that close. I believe that's the fewest points by quite a considerable margin that Iowa has been held to this year. Their previous low was against Looks like it was against Indiana when they lost 67-65. Holding Iowa to only 57 points is absolutely ridiculous. And they they were just so clearly the better basketball team, and every time they step on the floor, there's if there's something to pick at when you're talking about Michigan, they find a way to make that not nearly as big of a deal. And just every time they step on the floor against a Big Ten team, they look like the better basketball team, and that in and of itself is really really impressive with how difficult this conference is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was sort of that was my biggest observation from that game last night in particular was that right, it wasn't just one aspect where Michigan was slightly better and you could say well they were knocking down shots. I mean, it was pretty much across the board dominance in the second half. Now the first half was closer, but by that second half, you have Michigan shooting 56% from the field, turning the ball over just one time, holding Iowa to 28 points, 30% from the field in the second half. Just never let Iowa get any rhythm offensively in this game at all. And Iowa, you mentioned they never scored this many points, this few points in a game. They never scored fewer than 31 points and a half, and Michigan held them to that
In both
in both
halves.
halves last night. And like it was very convincing because it was just such a well-rounded in pretty much every aspect superior performance for Michigan. One of the big questions we had going into this game, or one of the things I think a lot of us were interested in seeing, is how Hunter Dickinson would fare against a big like Luka Garza. We talked about that on Monday, and the answer was pretty darn good.
Yeah, on both ends
He
of the floor too, which
exactly,
was
yeah,
genuinely surprising.
yeah, it was. I mean, Garza was just 1 of 9 from the field in the first half, and he shot just 31% from the field for the game. He turned the ball over a couple of times when Dickinson was guarding him, and Dickinson, meanwhile, was efficient. He was almost 50% from the field, not too far away from a double double himself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I mean, like you said, it was both ends of the floor.
It was a bad night for people trying to go to bat for Luka Garza's effectiveness at the next level,
Yeah.
because what Hunter Dickinson brings that almost nobody else in the country brings is size that is bigger than Luka Garza.
Right.
And he just Hunter Dickinson is not a good defender. I mean, we talked about that going into the Ohio State game. That, listen, are they going to be able to? Is Hunter Dickinson going to be able to do enough against EJ Liddell? Where do you put him? It's kind of a weird matchup, and it didn't go especially well. Now, on the other end of the floor, Dickinson was able to do whatever he wanted against EJ Liddell, so it sort of canceled each other out. But
Mm-hmm.
when I just sort of thought that Luka Garza might have 40 in this game, and looking
Yeah.
back, that's not that was definitely an overreaction to Hunter Dickinson's defense, or maybe lack thereof, because he's just massive, right? He's absolutely huge, and it was clear that Garza struggled with his length a little bit, and he got
Mm-hmm.
better. And that's not to say I don't feel any differently about Luka Garza, but if you're trying, this is a guy who is an incredible college basketball player, but you have a hard time trying to figure out where he's going to wiggle his way into the NBA and stay there, especially
Mm-hmm.
with the way the game is going now. And he's not super, he's not a super athletic guy. He's not, he and he's just never been a super, he's never been an elite defender, and we never talk about Luka Garza's defense. In fact, maybe we even talk about the opposite and how bad the team that he plays on is on defense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if size is going to bother Luka Garza, then we're not going to see Luka Garza in the NBA. We're just not. It's I mean, at least not for a long time. I fully expect him to get his shot, and this is certainly not to say that I hope he doesn't take full advantage of it, but I just, especially after last night, when you have a guy like Hunter Dickinson, who isn't that great defensively, but is big enough to bother you just with his size. And for him to sort of struggle the way that he did was not eye opening, but for a guy who's trying to prove that he can be effective in the NBA, that's what this season is really about. Everybody knows how good he is in college. Let's
Mhm.
continue to prove. And he's done that to a certain extent because he's a much better 3-point shooter than he was last year. And he's done some of those things, but when you're in the block, which is where he's most effective, it was clear that Hunter Dickinson's size was getting to him, and then you combine it with the fact that they were just 6 of 19 from the 3-point line. This
Yeah.
team is never going to beat anybody good if they make less than 10 3-pointers, and especially if they do that and only shoot 31%, right? Um,
Right.
Joe Wieskamp, 1 of 5 from the 3-point line. CJ Frederick made the only three that he took. That's the thing that really impressed me is that they didn't even. It's not like they just weren't making all of their looks. They weren't getting a ton of looks to begin with to even take the shot, and that's a testament to Michigan's
Right.
defense. But that was the thing that struck me. It was like it's not just that they went 11 of 35 from the 3-point line to go 31%. They went 6 of 19. They just had a hard time getting good looks, and that was a major testament to what Michigan was doing defensively.
Yeah, absolutely. That was sort of my next takeaway here was that right when you combine what Dickinson was able to do defensively against Garza with completely shutting down the perimeter and but it wasn't yet like you said it wasn't just a bad shooting night for Iowa. It was they weren't getting good looks, they weren't getting many opportunities, and that's a big factor because right when you can do both those things to Iowa, there's no chance. I mean, there are a few teams that are going to be a situation that have a big um, like Hunter Dickinson, but right, I mean, there's not a lot of paths for you to say, well, you know, Iowa has been limited on the perimeter and, Garza is struggling offensively, but or struggling is maybe, isn't his normal self.
Mm,
Clearly, there's not like many other, right? When both those things are happening at once, this Iowa team's not a team that's going to make up for it on defense by getting a ton of stops against elite teams and somehow scrapping and clawing a victory out when both those things aren't working for them. Yeah, it puts them in a spot where, I mean, I guess it's not, you know, if you tell me both of those things are going to happen, their perimeter shooters aren't going to get a lot of opportunities. They're not going to shoot it particularly well. Garza's going to, not be able to be his normal self. Then, yeah, there aren't any other things that are going to make me say, well, but I still think there's a chance of X, Y, or Z happening and them, clawing out something. That really kind of does it for them.
yeah.
And for Garza, yeah, I'm right there with you. I mean, this was right. We all know what he is capable of. He doesn't have anything else to prove in college basketball in terms of just his ability.
Mm-hmm.
But this was a test for him, an opportunity, and it just didn't. It does make you wonder, right? There's not going to be a lot of now. Maybe we see in the NCAA tournament, who they match up against, but there's not a lot of additional opportunities, and I'm not sure what their schedule is the rest of the way, but there's not going to be a lot of opportunities to see him face off against somebody like Hunter Dickinson again.
Right. It looks like so he'll get Iowa gets Ohio State next, so you'll get
Okay.
Garza versus EJ Liddell.
Hmm.
But then you get Nebraska, and then you get Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has guys that are certainly a test for Luka Garza, but um, don't expect him to have a ton of trouble with them. But you're right. I expected. Honestly, I was pretty impressed by Iowa's ability to stay pretty close in the first half
Hmm.
when neither team was playing especially well on the offensive side of the basketball. And then in the second half, it sort of continued for Iowa, but Isaiah Livers really got going. Franz Wagner really got going. He was spectacular. 21 points, 4 assists on 9 of 12 shooting in this game. He
Yeah.
made some passes last night that I haven't seen very 6'9" players make. I mean, he really
Yeah.
is impressive, and he's a really great passer, and especially in transition, he's really effective at 6'9", 220. He's talk about being able to carve a path. I can see a path for Wagner if he's going to be that dynamic with the ball in transition and shoots it well. 9 of 12 from the field is
Yeah.
spectacular, but it was Livers, Dickinson, and Wagner. I mean, Michigan's three best players were just far better than Iowa's three best players. I mean, you had Garza at 16, but it took him 19 shots to get 16 points. Wieskamp was 4 of 9. Frederick was 4 or 5 from the floor, but they were, he didn't go to the free throw line, and only one of those shots were 3 pointers. So that's not nearly as big of an impact as you would maybe expect a 4 or 5 night from CJ Frederick to be. McCaffrey only 0 of 2. Bohannon took a lot of shots, high volume guy like he usually is, but just 4 of 10 from the field. He had 13, and then they only got 8 points from their bench, only 8, and that's just not good enough
Yeah.
when what the starters gave you. Let's talk about
Yeah.
the at the end of the day. That was the outcome that I was expecting. Michigan at home. I think there's nobody in the country at this point who's going to go to bat for Iowa being the better basketball team than the Wolverines. That was expected. Maybe not so expected.
Mm-hmm.
The Michigan State Spartans 71-67 victory over Ohio State in East Lansing. And all of a sudden, first of all, this game was close throughout. And all of a sudden,
Mm-hmm.
Michigan State has now beat Illinois and Ohio State in back-to-back games, and they got more opportunities. And you might be in a position now that if you take care of business at home against IU, you probably want to beat Maryland on the road, but take care of business at home against IU. And if you find a way to beat Michigan in one of these games, you're all of a sudden right back into the thick of the conversation in the NCAA tournament when it's been months since we talked about Michigan State being an NCAA tournament quality team. But the back to back wins against top five teams 71-67. And now the Spartans in March, in February, March, late in the season, and finding a way to get wins. Aaron Henry playing some of the best basketball he has at Michigan State. He was 7 of 11 from the field, 18 points. He's now on a pretty impressive stretch as of recently. 18 points, 20 points, 17 points, 15 points, 13 points, 20 points, 16 points, 24 points in his last 8 games or whatever that was I just rattled off. And he played spectacularly again last night.
Yeah, it's amazing how fast this can your fate, your what we think of your team can change when you go and beat the team ranked fifth and then the team ranked fourth back to back. I mean, it's just sort of, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it's not like it's a surprise, and I'm not even saying that the discussion about Michigan State is undeserving because it's certainly, you know, it's a good conversation to be having. It's a worthy
In
conversation
this
because
family,
you
everyone
go
does
out
their own
and
laundry,
do that
but they
for
all
both
do it a
those
little
teams.
bit.
But it's just sort of amazing to me how much our perception of that team can change in a period of essentially like 48 hours because both those games, Tuesday and Thursday, the middle of this week, and all of a sudden the picture is quite different. And yeah, I mean, I'm seeing here, I was poking around at some of the bracketology that comes out daily, at least some of the updates that are out there. And I'm seeing at least a couple of places where Michigan State is now a playing in the first four and in some of these pictures, right, in some of these situations right now. And I don't really think that that's unwarranted. I mean, it's obviously we're gonna have to see how these last couple games shake out, and there's absolutely an opportunity that that something could happen and IU could upset. Like IU could pull out a win, and all of a sudden, they drop four in a row to end the season. That wouldn't stun me either. But I think right now it's certainly a valid conversation to have. I mean, I think that right now I can't argue with them being in the tournament field. Um, yeah, that was. I mean, I didn't get to see this as much of this game live as the other one, but all of a sudden, I mean, we knew this potential was there. I mean, we knew this that this team's capable of this kind of performance. I mean, now, not that anybody would ever predicted them to take down Ohio State and Illinois in consecutive games, but I mean, they're showing that. I mean, they're reminding us this potential isn't gone. Like they're capable of having games like this, and so they, in my head, are capable of going on a run at an NCAA tournament if they get an opportunity. I don't mean they're going to the Elite Eight or I'm penciling them in the Sweet 16, but this is a team where when things are clicking right, they can match up against the very best clubs teams in the country when their stars are capable of having big games that are going to sort of cancel out when the bench isn't productive. But you can't count on that.
Mm.
And right, I mean, this is one of my things that I sort of obsess about is sort of multiple paths to victory, and that could be strategically, but it can also just be personnel wise,
Sure.
right? Is and obviously this is an Ohio State team that, like you said, I've been excited about their depth, or intrigued, pretty confident in the depth that they have. So it's not a situation where, yeah, like you said, they could easily, right. I'm going to be watching these next couple games to end out the season for them, and it could easily be a situation where some of those bench pieces start performing and a lot more, or significantly better, and all of a sudden, my attitude toward them is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just, yeah, it's one of those things where it is a concern from, you face a great team in the NCAA tournament, and Liddell and Washington don't have good but not outstanding games. If you don't get enough support around them, it's not going to be enough if the circumstances aren't right for you. Just looking at the box score from this game, the number of, they have two starters who have 0 points, and then you see 2 points, 0, 0, 0. Yes, there's a 12 from Walker off the bench, but it's, that's a concern. Not a concern in, like, I don't think they're, I think that's certainly still valid to consider them the fourth, or fourth, pardon me, fourth best team in the country. In that next tier of teams beyond those top three. But it's something to watch. When you're comparing, right? You said, like, when we're nitpicking, when we're comparing the very top teams and sort of considering ways in which they could be, you know, upset in the NCAA tournament, or ways that things can fall apart. Like, that's certainly something that I'm going to be watching, because that's a potential concern for them moving forward. And um, as far as Michigan State, like you said, it's going to be interesting to see how they finish out the season. I don't have a ton else to say on them, other than that I am sort of continually interested in the offensive dynamic of this team.
Mm-hmm.
With, obviously, Aaron Henry has the ability to take over a game like he did last night, and they can match up against anybody, like you said. But it's also one of those things where, right, and this isn't a new theme for Michigan State, it's sort of a confidence that they're going to be able to have a guy take it over. I mean, he's obviously capable, but how much can you count on that on a given night? To those guys, to, a guy or two to be their big shot makers that can completely take over a game
Mm-hmm.
with consistency. That's sort of a question, but obviously, no doubt, still what they're capable of.
We'll see about Michigan State's. I'll be curious to see if they do what they're supposed to do the rest of the way.
Mm-hmm.
If that gets them in the tournament, because in theory,
Right.
if you're in the tournament right now, and Jerry Palm at CBS Sports has them in his last four in right now, in theory,
Yeah.
you shouldn't have to go beat Michigan just to get in the field, because you shouldn't beat Michigan at all. So it shouldn't
Right.
hurt you. But
Right.
if there are bubble teams around them who outperform themselves and find a way to win a game they're not supposed to, then maybe Michigan State needs to. You probably want them to win a game in the Big Ten tournament to feel even better.
Mm-hmm.
But it's what's even more interesting here is the conversation about the one seed, the fourth one seed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gonzaga's locked in, Baylor locked in, Michigan locked in, bearing something unforeseen, and we're getting to the point with all three of those teams that it almost doesn't matter what they do the rest of the way. Those are going to be three of your number one seeds. But Ohio State, now 2 losses in a row. It doesn't get much easier. Their next game is against Iowa, and their last game of the season is against Illinois. Illinois also. So maybe that game really knocks it down to, this is a 2-team conversation between Ohio State and Illinois. But Illinois also, Ayo Dosunmu out indefinitely with a broken face.
Mm-hmm.
What if they struggle down the stretch? They have Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio State all on the road to finish the season. Without Ayo Dosunmu, I don't really expect them to win any of those games. Um, so maybe that's going to be the saving grace for Ohio State, and the fact that they play each other at the end of the season. Maybe it comes down to whoever wins that game gets the last number one seed. But this is a much more interesting conversation than I thought it was going to be, because there's now more of an opportunity for a two seed to slide in there and maybe get that last number one seed, whether it's Villanova going all the way to, winning the Big East tournament, or it's Alabama
Hmm.
finishing strong and then winning the SEC tournament. West Virginia, I think, is sort of out, is way
Yeah.
out there, and I don't think we'll see that happen. But the point is still the same, that I just sort of thought it was a foregone conclusion that we had these five teams that were going to make up the four one seeds, right? In some way, shape, or form,
Right.
and specifically two teams fighting for that last one. And maybe there's a little bit more of an open spot, and the door is a little bit more open than I thought it would be.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch because, like you said, there isn't a clear. The door is sort of open enough for some team to potentially take advantage, and I don't really know exactly what that team is going to be. Obviously, you mentioned a couple of them. Alabama, maybe. Coming off a loss at Arkansas. You
Right.
look at, you know, Villanova. That's the team that maybe I'm looking at and thinking, like you said, if they win the Big East tournament, we have Oklahoma coming off a loss at Kansas State. I mean, like these teams that are in position to potentially capitalize are not sort of taking care of business here. So if I had to sort of pick a team that might be able to sort of get its way in there if things don't work out for Illinois and Ohio State here in the final games, um, it might be with the right combination Villanova.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's going to be interesting because you have a door that's maybe open a bit and no team that's right there to take advantage of it, at least as things stand right now. So it's going to be an interesting discussion here as we get the final games here until the selection Sunday.
Absolutely. We'll take a quick break. Come back with Humor Me, please. You're watching 110 Daily on the 110 Sports Network.